Hello, and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallants, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest. Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallants, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Nick Harley has joined me in the studio today. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Really looking forward to hearing about your journey today in terms of a successful leader. We always start the podcast by just getting to know our guests. So tell us a little bit about yourself and where your current focus is.
I'm currently MD of Euromaster UK, which is a business owned by Michelin, and two businesses: ATS Euromaster, which is the consumer-facing part of it, which is essentially a fast fit operation across England, Scotland, and Wales, and then another business called Truck Tire, which, funnily enough, sells and services trucks, and that also is a national business, but that's a mobile operation. So we have about 1,400 staff in various different roles. And then, probably more importantly, I'm married and have been for quite a long time. My wife will tell me, and two children grown up, and I'm expecting my first grandchild in March this year. So exciting times.
Congratulations. Do you know the sex?
Nope.
Exciting. That's good.
So even more exciting.
I got two grandchildren, so I've got an 18-month-old and a 6-month-old. So it's fantastic. You can always give them back at the end of the day. It's brilliant. So I'm already very happy for you around that. Good, super. Well, we'll come to obviously other things that you do outside of work later in terms of that work-life balance. But let's go way back. We always look at this podcast about our childhoods, and I truly believe that every single person in the world that's born has this capacity to lead. It's born into them, and then obviously their environment either really encourages that, or sometimes it actually works against it. So tell us a little bit about your childhood environment as you're growing up, the role models around you, and how that informed your early leadership style.
Yeah, I had reflection. I had a pretty good childhood. My main sort of preoccupation from the age of 5 onwards was on ponies, and the family had ponies. My aunt, who is only about 10 years older than me, ran a little riding school, and we had a lot of horses around. And there was a lot of activity around the environment, and that was what I did most of the time, jumping on and off ponies for the early part of my life. So that was good fun. Always outside, just kicking around in the stable yard and doing that sort of stuff, which sounds pretty idyllic. Actually, what that meant was getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and cleaning out, mucking out 10 stables before school. It was when I was from about sort of 12, 13 onwards. So that probably helped to instill the sort of work ethic in my mind. That really was quite character for me, because at that age you need your sleep, and as I got older and got into teenage years, I probably wasn't going to bed as early as I had been, but I was still getting up early and mucking out the horses. So that was the first part of it, and that was also linked with schooling and moving from a little prep school with only a very few people in it, and then I moved from that sort of private school environment into a comprehensive school. And my earliest memory of comprehensive school was being sent to this huge school, well, huge in my mind at the time, in shorts, by my mother, who was convinced that that's what you did when you sent your son to school at 11. And turning up at school for the school bus, and then at school, and being the only kid in shorts at 11. your first day of school, which I can laugh about now, but it was a massive humiliation. And the only way I sort of got through that initial slightly embarrassing situation was actually being pretty good at rugby. And when you're sort of in the rugby team and a forward, because I was pretty big at that stage, that really helped. So some
And you could
some
wear your
great
shorts
times.
playing rugby.
Sorry.
You could wear your shorts playing rugby.
Yeah,
Still as well, right?
exactly. That was the only time I wore shorts. I can tell you from then on. So yeah. Overall, pretty good. Pretty good.
Excellent. So this just come to me now, and not everyone does this at this age. But as you were growing up during those teenage years in I went to comprehensive as well, and certainly as character building. But during those years, did you remember ever having at that point a dream in terms of what you want to do with your life?
Yes. Yes, I can. I wanted to be an estate manager. I wanted to run a country estate. That was my ambition, which is obviously why I'm running a tyre business now. So best laid plans, etc. And actually, that was probably my first major disappointment. I've had lots of embarrassing moments, which I've shared one of them with you. But my first big disappointment was that my parents weren't particularly encouraging of that career choice. And they took me through a couple of sort of sessions with friends of theirs who were involved in, I suppose, property agency and that side of it. And this was obviously sort of, 35, 40, 35 years ago, 40 years ago. And they dissuaded me from going down this route and sort of said, look, at that time, unless your parents owned the estate, you wouldn't get a job as an estate manager, which in hindsight really wasn't the case. So I decided to do something else and got persuaded to go and do law at university, but never really had my heart in it. And I actually didn't get to university because I decided to take a year out. And during that time, I got a job with an estate agent in Swindon. And Swindon was a boom time during the sort of 80s. Swindon was having a boom time in the 80s. And I started off on purely commission only and a very small sort of red Ford Fiesta and started off in the property game, which I thought I would only be in for 3 months before I went off to university. And every time I came to leave, they offered me a bit more money and a slightly bigger Ford, which was probably more important at the time. And I ended up running an office within that year, which at the time was quite lucrative, and I had an even bigger, whizzier Ford. And so I never went to university.
Sure. And let's just look at that for a minute, if we may. So I'm really curious about that childhood experience you had, even though it sounded idyllic, but you were working hard. You'll find out what hard work was, getting up in the mornings. And obviously I know about estate agency as well and that kind of sales environment. So do you think the two were linked there in terms of why they felt you were a good fit for that role, in terms of that ability to show that you could work hard and slog it out?
Yes, I think, it was pretty cutthroat. We worked 8 till 8, 6 days a week. And a lot of people came and went during that period. And I guess that's when I first realized that I'm actually quite stubborn and focused and resilient, because I felt a little bit like I had when I had gone from prep school into comprehensive school. I didn't feel as though I really fitted into the environment, but I was determined I was going to show them that I could be as good as everybody else. So there was that sort of stubbornness or resilience or determination, call it what you will, that really drove me to show that, hey, I do want that next forward, or that ability to earn more. And at that stage, quite frankly, it's all about how much money can I earn and how can I beat the top performer in that office. So it was very competitive.
And when you became the office manager, this is where I love this kind of transition piece, where obviously it's not about necessarily being the most competitive in that sense. You're managing then other people,
yes,
and potentially leading them. What did you notice then in terms of what had served you to that point, maybe wasn't serving you as well at that sort of young age still?
Yeah, this was the classic appointing your best salesperson to be the sales manager is not always the right move. So I was 19 when they put me in charge of an office with 3 other negotiators and a couple of office support administrators, and absolutely no training whatsoever. Literally, it was, you're now in charge of an office. And so what does that mean then? Well, it means you get a bigger car and more money. Okay. And here's your targets. Go do it. And it was, and the fact that I was 19 and everybody but one was older than me at that age is quite daunting. And so it really was about being able to not just prove that I could sell houses, I could sell more houses than other people in the same environment, but it was being able to motivate others to do that, and others who thought they were going to be in line for running that office as well. So not only was it, we're all in this together, but it was sort of, well, actually, we're not all in this together, because you've come in and essentially taken an opportunity away from me. Was a couple of the guys' attitudes. And it was only really then that after a couple of weeks of just trying to work harder and trying to be there earlier and later, that I realized that I didn't really need to be there earlier and later. I just needed to harness the whole team. So we had a very basic conversation. We had a team meeting down the pub on a Friday night and said, look, how are we going to make this work? Because we all benefit if it works better. So they told me they had their feelings. He luckily didn't really respond in the way that I was feeling at the time. And from there, we sort of started to build a coalition of each of our aspirations, and it worked, amazingly. You try these things and sometimes they don't work. And as we went through the process, there were a few things that we tried as a group that we talked about trying that didn't work, but then there were other successes which came from the negotiators and the team. Tell us how we can do better. I don't know all the answers. And actually, all of that, I don't know all the answers, we're only going to get to the answer if we work together, has worked me very well all the way through, right up until the present.
That's a great early lesson, isn't it, when you're that age? And I remember in the 80s and 90s when I had those lunches at the pub where we had a team meeting. They usually extended into the afternoon, actually. But so those were the days. So talk us a little bit more then, so the audience gets this. As you were developing your 20s, so that decade of your 20s, really, you'd already had this now springboard of actually learning about collaboration and that the whole is bigger than the parts, etc. So just talk to us about your leadership development journey in your 20s.
Yeah. So after a while, I got married, and we had our first child when I was 25, so quite young. And I realized that working 6.5 days a week was not very conducive to family life. And so I moved into a corporate job in the relocation industry, which at that time was actually quite a thriving industry. It's really declined in the last 20 years, but it was really a very busy industry at that stage. It was linked to property. And so I thought that the transition from running a sort of a small estate agency office to going into a corporate role as an account manager, running accounts for people like Barclays Bank, National Grid. And again, I came into this role, and I'd got the role because one of the directors of the estate agents had moved in to be a senior manager in the relocation business. And she'd always said, look, if you're looking for a role, come and see me. So I did, and she gave me a role. But there was no real transition out of, I won't call it corner shop, but almost that sort of small environment with very little corporate understanding into my first meeting with the head of relocation for Barclays Bank. And it was in the days where we had acetates and overhead projectors and all of those elements where you're expected to give a presentation and update, which had been prepared for me, but I'd never done anything like it. And my boss was with me. And as we walked in to the room, he said, so how many of you, have you done a lot of this before? And I said, well, no, this is my first one. And a look of absolute horror came over his face that, he was putting this guy in front of Barclays. And I muddled my way through it. Not very well, I have to say. And I think if I think about that in terms of leadership, what I did immediately after that, I sat down with him in the car and said, I am not ever going through that again. You've got to give me, and I'm quite prepared to do this, but a fast track into corporate life. What are the things I can say, can't say? How do I do this presentation thing? The lesson I had from that was never assume that people actually know what you expect from them and have the experience that their job role might be giving the impression it has. So asking those basic questions at interview stage or just when you come into a role has actually served me very well. And just saying, look, tell me what experience have you got? What are you good at? What do we need to work on together to make you even better? And it's amazing what has come out of those conversations where I've come into a business and I've said to some very senior people, so, when I'm new to this, you're new to me. Tell me, is there anything about this business or anything about your role that you need to get better at that we can work on? And the most amazing things have come out of that. And I remember going into one business and helping a very senior operations director who'd only been in the business 2 years, who said to me, I actually don't know what some of the acronyms mean, but I didn't ask up front and I'm too embarrassed to ask now. Now, very, very tiny element, but he felt that he could tell me that. And I said, that's cool. I'll just keep asking all those questions and let's get a list of acronyms because I can be the dumb one for at least a month. Between us, we can work it out. So never assume, I guess. That was a very
And I love that.
long-winded
Well, I
answer.
love that. No, I love that because in my experience, and you've obviously worked with many chief executives and many MDs, and I think that lesson is really, really important. There are too many leaders, and it's not always their fault. It's the way they've learned from others, where they need to be the smartest person in the room or they have to know the answers. Whereas what you're talking about is by not knowing and demonstrating not knowing, showing the vulnerability, it means others in your relationships can do the same thing. So I love that. So let's move on to your 30s. And obviously we're getting more mature now. It depends. We're all very different ages and different rates. But what were you learning in your 30s around leadership and how did that manifest for you?
I think in my 30s, I had moved from the relocation business and I was working for what was essentially a startup business, but within a much larger business. So they'd invested in a small business. So it was still in the corporate environment, but actually run by an entrepreneur. As a lot of entrepreneurs are, fairly volatile and would taught me that you should never, ever consider that you can't do something. So I joined that business to run a division, and we, within the first, it was about a 10 million turnover business. And I was there for about 4 or 5 years, and we grew it from 10 million turnover to 80 million turnover. It was about 100 people and ended up with about 1,000 people in that time. So it was a really exciting time. And what I learned during that time was actually in that corporate environment that was being held at bay, having that space to just go do stuff and see if it works. It's not something you get the opportunity to do very often, especially in the corporate environment. And I was doing stuff and most of it was working, but quite a lot wasn't as well. And it was sort of okay because we were in that environment where we had the license to do it. And I remember we were expanding rapidly in the UK and there were 5 of us on the board of this business. And the MD, who was the entrepreneur who'd sort of sold the idea into the leasing company, said, right, we need to go into Europe now. So Nick, stop what you're doing. I want you to go to Europe and buy a business in Europe. And okay, I've never worked in Europe before. I've never bought a business before. Where do you want me to start? Well, I don't know. Just go and do it. And it literally, and I'm not exaggerating that, Andrew, it was exactly that. So I then spoke to a guy in the corporate business that was working alongside us and said, look, this is what David's asked me to do. What do I do next? And he said, well, which country are you looking at? I said, well, I don't know. So long story short, we ended up going and buying a business in just outside Maastricht, and I spent a year sort of working through that process, and that sort of whole piece around giving big tasks, objectives can be really motivating if you're just prepared to go and do it. But what I learned from it is that you can't just do that by yourself. You have to find the right people and the right tools and the right information to be able to go and take that huge task or objective and then narrow that down to actually bringing home the target. And what I saw was the MD did that with a couple of other people, and it failed dramatically because they needed more context and they needed more help right up front, frame what they were supposed to be doing and give them more of some guidelines and rules around it. I was okay then because actually I was still quite naive, and I just thought, oh, well, I can go do this. It's okay. And actually it was two older people on the board who really struggled with it and really failed with it because they were in that environment and were not naive enough to think, yeah, I can do this. The leadership lesson was just make sure you've given enough context for the individual and be prepared to ask them, are you okay with this? And if I were to help you more, where would that help sit?
Well, I'm loving the variety of experiences you're talking us through. I'm just wondering if you could maybe summarize at this point, when you've been through this experience in terms of setting the business up in Maastricht, etc. What were you learning then about the types of environments that really fulfilled you in terms of work and leadership for the future roles that might come?
At this time, I'm going to say wasn't a lot of self-reflection. So I was just doing stuff and having a great time, to be honest. So reflecting on it now, I was learning that I thrive on challenge. I thrive on ambiguity, and I'm quite easily bored. So the things that I look for in my career are, okay, what's the challenge that I'm addressing here? Have I done that challenge before? Do I know how to do that? And usually if I don't know how to do it, that's what attracts me. So challenge always sounds a bit of a cliche, but it's the unknown and the new experience and the uncertainty, I think, that attracts me to certain roles and certain experiences. But I'm aware in a leadership environment that isn't always the same. A lot of other people don't feel that way. And a lot of people, actually, that's their worst nightmare. And to put them into that environment, if you do, you need to give a lot of support, context, and emotional time as well.
And it's really interesting you say that, but bear in mind what you described about yourself, even though you weren't reflecting back then. What I also imagine is when you are in those environments as a leader, because of the confidence and self-belief you have in yourself that you actually can thrive in this environment, it means those that are following you in a business that may feel discomfort are more likely to actually then follow you in that sense because they can see the confidence. Whereas you say there's some others that wouldn't be with that. So let's move into our 40s. And what I'm also wanting to understand here, because you're now learning, even if it's not reflection, it's obviously an experience some of the time as well. What's working for you? What works from a leadership perspective? What doesn't in certain environments? But it's quite tricky then during that period as we get older to really sustain some of that because we've got other stakeholders that come into our world. So just talk to us about that kind of angle.
Yeah, so I moved on from the sort of European experience, and I joined BP at that stage. And in the Castrol side of the business, the lubricants business, much bigger organization, much wider horizons. And what I learned there was this whole element of, yeah, you can dive in and do stuff, Nick, and usually you make it happen, but you can't do that on your own in this much wider environment. And if I reflect back on a lot, there's a bit of a theme of moving into new where people have assumed my experience has been if you like, a rounded experience. In many cases, I've learned so much from moving between companies, and mainly between companies rather than between roles. But the whole idea of doing something in Castrol without aligning people up front, even so much as going to a fairly normal meeting and presenting an idea or a new concept or whatever, without doing a lot of pre-work in advance, and I'd very rarely done that previously. It would be usually been right. Yeah, this is it. We're, fairly small board. It was just crack on, do stuff. Here it was, you need to understand this importance of stakeholder management, but also it's a credibility piece within that environment. So as I was in my fees, it became much more of a considered stepping back from leading the charge to selecting who was going to lead the charge on my team. And I became far more aware of the different cultures in that stakeholder management, because a lot of my work in Castrol was actually outside the UK. So I spent most of my time on a plane. I had a global role in one part of it and a European, Europe and Africa regional role in others. Spent a lot of time in places like Japan, US, Turkey, China. So very, very different stakeholder mapping and very, very different cultural management. So I spent way more time sitting back and planning, not what I was going to do, but how I was going to align and engage stakeholders around that whole concept or plan. I would like to say that was wholly successful. It wasn't. Some great examples of in my early days of people always, I won't name the country, but I'm sitting there and saying, yes, absolutely, we agree. Absolutely, yeah, fine. We'll go ahead with that. Me flying back in 6 months later, nothing had happened. Nothing at all. And when they said yes, they actually meant there is no way we're going to do anything. And it was just a learning curve of, I understand when people say yes in this culture, they mean actually maybe. Yes, in another culture, it means no, not ever are we going to do that. So yeah, that was probably my biggest lesson during my 40s was how do you combine that cross-cultural piece with stakeholder management and engagement and leading teams across different environments as well, to make sure that they combine and we use the best skills from everywhere rather than relying on perhaps a core team that very well.
I agree. And what I love about what you've just shared there is that, in my experience, so many leaders, and this is just very, very normal, underestimate the amount of time they need to spend in stakeholder relationships before they get into that kind of senior role.
Absolutely.
And it always takes them by surprise, and also feels very different in terms of reward and value, because they've been rewarded in the past for doing and leading from the front and demonstrating and role modeling what needs to happen. And suddenly, as you say, it's not necessarily in the limelight anymore. It's in the back rooms and the side rooms. And that's quite a different position for many leaders. So thank you for sharing that. And what about now, leading up to where you currently are? Talk to us about those years and where you're at now in terms of, I guess, your leadership journey and what it is you're still learning.
I'm still learning that nothing beats getting out and talking to people that do the job. So the business that I'm involved in at the moment, we have a lot of people who are out in vans, out in points of sale, fitting tires. It's in some cases quite a risky job if the safety isn't right. It's in many cases at this time of year, it's cold. It's not a great environment to be in if you get it wrong. And so what I have seen over the last 5 years and learned is really nothing beats, in terms of safety and in terms of embedding a culture in a business, going out and talking to people, understanding how they're really feeling, not what's in the staff survey, how people feel when I park my car and walk into one of our points of sale. And when I first did it, people would say, is everything okay? Are we okay? Is everything fine? And I'd say, yeah, just want to come and have a chat. And now they're used to it a bit more because they get this guy turn up and just want to have a chat. And, what will happen if I go and ask one of the technicians who's changing that tire about our life-saving rules? Will he be able to tell me what they are? And you can tell a lot by the way that the centre manager reacts when you ask that question as to whether his attitude to safety is the same as ours and how we want to embed that culture of safety. So I think probably later than I should have understood this, but I've really transitioned out of the sort of 13 years at BP, and then I moved on to Goodyear in another corporate role, which didn't really involve people who were working at what I would call the sharp end. And I know that's a real overused cliche, but people who are actually doing a job which involves manual activity, which is risky. It really gets you to understand what is happening in our business and what I need to focus on, which is going to be important to the people who are actually earning the money for this business. So it is that connection with our main breadwinners, if you like, in the business.
Love that. We've got time for 2 more questions in the last 5 minutes, Nick. So I'm really enjoying our time together. And the first question may take time to reflect on this, but there's always an answer if we dig deep on this one. So if you look back at the whole of your career, what do you think, when you reflect, was a setback for you at the time, but probably presented the biggest gift for you moving forward in terms of your life?
I'm just trying to narrow the list down of setbacks, Andrew. But I think there was a big blow to my confidence was when I worked in the business I've been talking about, where I went and bought a European business. After that had happened, I came back to the UK and I was a commercial director, and the entrepreneur that had been running that business said, look, I'm stepping away. I'm going to become chairman and I want you to be the MD. That was on a Friday afternoon. He said, I want you to be the MD. I want you to think about it over the weekend, and we'll talk again on Monday. So I went home, obviously delighted, talked to my wife, we were planning lots of things, went back in on the Monday, and he said, oh yeah, that conversation on Friday, I've changed my mind over the week. And I'm going to bring in somebody with more experience to run the business. So that was the biggest blow to my confidence. Relatively early corporate career, but it taught me to really just be probably more hard-edged and resilient, and really never believe anything until you've got it in writing and you've actually started it. And that has stood me in really good stead. But unfortunately, it makes us quite cynical in the way that we're in our interactions if we're not careful. So I've tried to stay away from that.
Yeah, and very, very normally in these kind of environments when it happens. So, final question. I really enjoyed our time. And really, I'm asking this question because I've seen and heard from you your career path, and I got this sense of you very much living in the moment. And obviously, you said very honestly, not reflecting as much in your early career. So if somebody's listening to this or watching this now, where maybe people say to them, yeah, but you don't really plan your career, do you? And yet they're feeling actually they're doing okay. What advice would you give to them in terms of that kind of approach to their lives?
I think my career plan didn't happen. So what I would say is you can plan as much as you like, but certain opportunities will present themselves to you as you go through your career. And I would encourage you really, really evaluate each of those opportunities, and don't reject anything at first glance. Have a look at it and really reflect on how that's going to affect your life, and not necessarily does it fit in with your career plan, but is it something that you think you're going to enjoy doing and that may give you a different experience to the one you're currently enjoying or not enjoying, depending on where you are in your life. But don't reject anything at first. Really work it through and take the opportunity to see what that might hold for you. But enjoy what you do.
Well, Nick, I've really enjoyed having you on the show today. It's been great to hear your story. All the people out there that are listeners watching this will be able to pick something from that story that will resonate with them, from the hard work, obviously younger in life, to then having to make that transition in terms of the stakeholder engagement, and obviously now learning later in life the importance of being at the sharp end with the people that actually make it happen for us. So thanks again for being on the show. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Andrew. So have I.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Talents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.